In this video, I am going to attempt to synthesize the idea in Judaism that Jesus is boiling in excrement, the hidden meaning behind this in the Cube films, and a personal experience I had with an entity involving synchronicity and what it claimed it did to someone whom I later came to realize was Jesus. I know this may all sound crazy, but at least hear me out before you decide one way or the other. To begin, let's look at where this idea comes from. In the Babylonian Talmud, it states that at some point, the spirit of Jesus was summoned from the dead through necromancy and asked about his punishment in the afterlife. He allegedly tells the questioner that his punishment is being boiled in excrement because he mocked the words of the sages. For many people, this can simply be dismissed as an expression of disdain toward Jesus on the part of those who wrote the text. At face value, it appears to be either a literal claim or an insult made out of spite. However, I do not believe that is how this passage is meant to be interpreted, and I will now explain what I believe is actually being communicated through this sensationalist statement. In Kabbalah, or Jewish mysticism, we can look at the tree of life, which symbolically corresponds to the human body. Within the tree of life, we need to focus on Malkuth, the lowest of the Sephirot. To understand the phrase boiling in excrement, we first need to understand Malkuth. Malkuth represents the physical universe, physical incarnation, the seed, and the fertilizer from which the seed grows. Symbolically, excrement is simply another form of fertilizer. It is also associated with transmutation and transformation. One example of this symbolism is the phoenix rising from the ashes. Like the phoenix rising from the ashes, the boiling water represents transmutation. If you look at the symbolism of hell, you can start to see this. The fiery imagery of hell is symbolic of a fire that burns away impurities and excess. In this interpretation, hell is a forge for souls rather than a punishment. Anyone familiar with the symbolism of Malkuth can quickly piece together what boiling in excrement is meant to signify. The wording is meant to be interpreted by initiates, whereas the profane take the literal interpretation. Put bluntly, it is a claim that Jesus is undergoing reincarnation into a physical body. By itself, this interpretation may not be convincing. However, I ask that you keep it in mind because the same symbolic pattern appears elsewhere. Next, I want to tell you about an experience I had with an entity that took me out of my body one night and onto what appeared to be a ship. During the experience, it told me things that I did not fully comprehend at the time, although I thought I did. The ship looked as though it was made from some kind of polished black stone. There were no corners anywhere. Everything was rounded, smooth, surreal, and ominous. I found myself in a very large room with the entity standing behind me. I never actually saw it, but I could hear its voice. It showed me a monolith-like structure jutting out of the floor. Behind it was a shallow pool of water. Near the top of the structure were elongated spikes extending outward from each side, with another spike protruding from the top. The entity told me that they sometimes allow high-ranking officers to roam freely on their ship. It then showed me a vision of what appeared to be a normal American military officer walking around by himself. The entity explained that the monolith-like structure in front of me was, in a sense, a computer. It told me that within this computer was an operating system and that one of these high-ranking officers had betrayed their trust, stolen the operating system, and brought it back to Earth. According to the entity, what the officer did not know was that the operating system possessed the ability to send a signal back to the ship if something like this occurred. This ultimately led to the officer being captured. I was then shown another vision. In it, a rat was scouring through a filthy room while a massive entity gleefully murdered it with a knife. The symbolism seemed clear to me. The rat represented the officer, and the entity appeared proud of having killed him for his betrayal. I am fully aware of how bizarre and nonsensical this sounds. It sounded that way to me as well, after the experience. However, hear me out. At the time, I didn't know what to make of any of it. Then, not long afterward, I watched the Cube series with my wife and began noticing a series of synchronicities that corresponded to what I had been shown during that experience. These synchronicities caused me to reconsider the entire event. I began to suspect that what I had been shown was symbolic rather than literal. To understand why, we need to look at Cube Zero. In Cube Zero, we are introduced to Eric Wynn, a junior programmer who serves as an apprentice to Dodd. From this point forward, I will mostly refer to him by his nickname, Chessman. Eric Wynn and Dodd oversee the Cube, a structure in which people have their memories wiped and are thrown inside to navigate their way out. Theoretically, escape requires cooperation and compassion, although it rarely works out that way. The Cube itself was created by a corporation called Izon. To me, it is fairly obvious that Izon is an anagram of Zion. You can watch my other video on how mountains symbolically represent the human body if you want a deeper explanation for why the corporation was named after a mountain. For the sake of brevity, however, Zion is traditionally understood as the place where God resides, or at least what people assume is God. This film is heavily Gnostic in its symbolism. Rather than pointing toward a true God, it points toward a demiurge presiding over the Cube. The movie begins with Eric Wynn expressing disgust toward the killings taking place within the Cube. Much like in many near-death experiences, it is implied that everyone who enters the Cube has agreed to do so. Chessman receives his nickname because of his fascination with chess, which symbolically represents the struggle between opposing forces. Eric Wynn is also portrayed as a prodigy at the game. This next scene presents Zion as a place of evil. The word sin is actually an archery term meaning to miss the mark. To sin is to miss the mark. It is to act unconsciously rather than consciously. Now we see Eric Wynn beginning to develop genuine concern for a woman trapped inside the Cube. Eventually, he accesses her files and discovers that she never actually signed a consent form. After witnessing the corruption, torment, and suffering endured by those trapped within the Cube, Eric Wynn decides to take action. At this point, you may have already realized who I believe Eric Wynn represents. I believe Eric Wynn is symbolic of Jesus. So far, I believe the film is presenting a narrative in which Jesus helped maintain the Cube on behalf of Zion, or the demiurge, until his compassion for those suffering within it and his growing disdain for the system led him to rebel and incarnate in order to help save others. In the next clip, what I would call an archonic figure enters the scene and explains that Eric Wynn, or Jesus, as I will refer to him from this point forward, did not have his memory wiped, which is against procedure. Take note that this archonic figure repeatedly refers to Jesus as a mouse. Later, he begins referring to him as a rat. This immediately stood out to me because, in my experience, the entity showed me the individual who stole the operating system as a rat. This is where the symbolism became particularly interesting to me because it began overlapping with details from my own experience. In this clip, Jesus describes himself as a computer guy. In my experience, the entity referred to the monolith as a computer and described what was stolen as an operating system. Now we come to what genuinely shocked me when I first saw it. In this next clip, the characters must jump into water in order to exit the cube. This symbolism appears frequently in esoteric traditions. It represents being born again or passing through mercurial waters in order to complete the philosopher's stone. If that sounds strange, I would recommend watching my video titled, "Are the Holy Trinity and the Philosopher's Stone the Same?" In the next clip, what I believe is being depicted is Jesus being forced to reincarnate.
Eric Wynn, as you have been found guilty of high treason, sabotage, various other crimes against your country and your God, and so on and so forth, blah, blah, blah.
Your sentence has been extended for 2 more lifetimes.
What sentence? I don't even remember the trial.
Oh, well, you were found guilty. No further questions.
And now, the final scene.
Don't touch me.
Don't worry, this won't hurt.
Wait!
These are very special because they were drawn by a very special person.
Is he a superhero too?
Yes. Yes, he is.
So in my view, this is what is meant by the claim that Jesus is boiling in excrement. Rather than describing eternal punishment, I believe it serves as an occulted way of saying that Christ is being reincarnated back into physical reality. As for my experience with the entity, you may think I was mistaken, deceived, or drawing connections where none exist. That's fair enough. I cannot prove what happened, and I still do not fully understand it myself. All I can really say is that is what I experienced, and the symbolic parallels I later discovered compelled me to share it. I personally am left with more questions than answers. Take from it what you will. Thanks for watching.